In late summer 1943, the war on the Eastern Front entered a new strategic phase. The defeat of the German offensive at Kursk in July and the subsequent Soviet operations toward Orel and Kharkiv had shifted the initiative decisively to the Red Army. In the broad arc from Smolensk to the Sea of Azov, German formations were no longer planning major offensives. They were trying to stabilize a retreat, preserve combat-worthy units, and avoid a collapse that might open the road to the western borders of the Reich. On the southern half of this line, in Ukraine, both command staffs understood that the next series of operations would decide the fate of the country's industrial and agricultural heartland. For the Soviet leadership, Ukraine combined several layers of importance. Its coal mines and metallurgy in the Donbass, the hydroelectric and industrial complex along the Dnieper, and the grain-producing regions of the steppe were critical to any post-war reconstruction planning. Politically, the Soviet government presented the liberation of Ukraine as a central goal, both for internal morale and for demonstrating to the Allies that it was capable of sustained large-scale offensives. At the military level, the Dnieper Line was seen not only as a geographic objective, but as a barrier that had to be crossed before any advance toward the borders of pre-war Poland, Romania, and ultimately Central Europe could be contemplated. On the German side, Army Group South regarded Ukraine as indispensable. Under the command of Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, it controlled 1st Panzer Army, 4th Panzer Army, 8th Army, and 6th Army, with over 1.1 million personnel by early November 1943, supported by roughly 700 operational tanks, 271 assault guns, and the aircraft of Luftflotte 4. The area's coal, steel, and food resources fed both the German war economy and the occupation system. Strategically, the planned withdrawal to the Dnieper Line offered the chance to shorten the front, anchor defences on a major river, and free mobile units to respond to future Soviet thrusts. The Dnieper was therefore intended to become a new defensive barrier after the failure of the Kursk offensive. The Soviet High Command, the Stavka, viewed that same river very differently. Rejecting any long pause on the eastern bank, it planned a strategic offensive along almost the entire Dnieper course. In the southern sector, the main burden would fall on 4 fronts: Voronezh Front under Nikolai Vatutin, Steppe Front under Ivan Konev, Southwestern Front under Rodion Malinovsky, and Southern Front under Fyodor Tolbukin. Together, they formed a contiguous operational belt from the Sumy-Kharkiv region down through the Donbass to the Azov coast. Further north, Central and later Belarusian formations would also fight along the river, turning the wider Battle of the Dnieper into a series of linked operations. By 26 August 1943, when the Battle of the Dnieper formally began, Soviet forces committed to the overall operation numbered about 2,633,000 personnel, more than 51,000 guns and mortars, around 2,400 tanks and assault guns, and approximately 2,850 combat aircraft. Opposing them in the Ukrainian and adjacent sectors were German and Romanian forces totaling over 1.1 million men by early November, with nearly 1,000 operational armoured fighting vehicles and several hundred aircraft. In numerical terms, the Red Army possessed a considerable advantage, but the Germans still held strongly fortified positions, more experienced mid-level staffs, and a significant ability to concentrate mobile reserves at critical sectors. The front line in Ukraine alone extended for several hundred kilometres. The broader Dnieper battlefront, from Smolensk in the north to the Black Sea coast, reached roughly 1,400 kilometres. Within this, the sector controlled by Voronezh, Steppe, southwestern and southern fronts spanned about half that distance. Coordinating attacks and logistics along such a wide zone posed new challenges. Supply lines had to reach armies converging from the Belgorod-Kharkiv axis in the north and from the Donbass in the south, while Soviet railheads struggled to keep pace with the advancing troops. The Stavka's intention was to maintain continuous pressure along this entire strip so that Army Group South could not simply withdraw in orderly stages. Preceding operations in the Donbass during July and early August had provided a mixed prelude. The first Donbass strategic offensive, conducted by the southwestern and southern fronts, committed more than 1 million Soviet troops and over 1,800 tanks, but failed to achieve a decisive breakthrough at the cost of nearly 100,000 Soviet casualties. German 6th Army and 1st Panzer Army suffered more than 21,000 casualties, but preserved their positions along key lines such as the Mius River. These engagements taught both sides lessons. Soviet staffs recognized that breaking German defenses in the open steppe required closer integration of infantry, armor, and artillery over broad sectors, while the Germans confirmed that elastic defense and rapid counterattacks by panzer formations could still impose high losses and delay Soviet operational goals. Civilian populations across left bank Ukraine entered this new phase of the war in exhausted conditions. Many villages had already experienced occupation since 1941, with forced labor, requisitions, and reprisals accompanying both German security measures and the earlier Soviet retreats. Local reactions to the approaching front were varied. Some inhabitants expected the Red Army as a return to pre-war authority. Others feared renewed mobilization, accusations of collaboration, or the destruction that came with heavy artillery and air bombardment. Ukrainian, Russian, Jewish, and other communities in the region thus faced the coming offensive from different personal and collective experiences, but all confronted the likelihood that their towns, bridges, and fields would again become active battle zones. Intelligence assessments on both sides emphasized the scale of what was coming. Soviet planners estimated that Army Group South would try to fall back behind the Dnieper while holding key industrial regions as long as possible. German staff officers, drawing on reconnaissance and intercepted signals, concluded that the Red Army intended not a limited advance to the river, but an attempt to cross it quickly using improvised means, turning the natural barrier into a staging line rather than a stopping point. This divergence in expectations would shape the entire Lower Dnieper offensive. 4 Soviet fronts attempting to maintain uninterrupted momentum over hundreds of kilometers, and German forces seeking to trade space for time, preserve their core units, and turn each river line and urban center into a delaying position on the road to the Dnieper. The opening phase of the Lower Dnieper offensive began not with a single assault, but with a sequence of coordinated directives from the Soviet High Command. At the end of August 1943, Stavka orders issued on August 22nd to 25th instructed Voronezh, Steppe, southwestern and southern fronts to continue their advance without pause from the Kharkiv, Izium and Mayos sectors toward the Dnieper. Each front received specific axes and timeframes, but the overall concept was unified. Prevent Army Group South from stabilizing along intermediate river lines and force it into a continuous withdrawal toward the Dnieper under pressure. Command structures reflected this ambition. To the north, Voronezh Front under General Nikolai Vatutin directed 38th, 40th and 27th Armies, reinforced by the 1st Tank Army and the 3rd Guards Tank Army, toward Poltava, Kremenchuk, and the Middle Dnieper. South of Vatutin, Steppe Front under General Ivan Konev controlled 5th Guards, 7th Guards, and 53rd Armies, among others, with tank and mechanized corps allocated for rapid exploitation. Further south, Southwestern Front under General Rodion Malinovsky operated with 6th, 12th, and 8th Guards armies, aiming at the Donbass and the segment of the Dnieper between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia. On the extreme southern wing, Southern Front under General Fyodor Tolbukin concentrated 5th Shock, 2nd Guards, and 51st Armies toward the lower Dnieper and the Azov coast. Opposite them, Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein attempted to manage an orderly retreat. In the north, 4th Panzer Army defended the approaches to Poltava and Kremenchuk. 8th Army held central Ukraine east of the Dnieper, including important communication hubs and river crossings. 1st Panzer Army guarded the northern Donbass and routes toward the Dnieper Bend, while the reconstituted 6th Army defended the southern Donbass and the Azov littoral. Operational control over Luftflotte 4 provided the German side with air support, but aircraft numbers were limited and had to be shifted frequently between sectors. On 26 August, Voronezh and Steppe fronts opened the main phase with offensives west of Kharkiv, and along the Poltava axis, Soviet forces, supported by concentrated artillery groups and air attacks, sought to break through German intermediate positions before they could be fully organized. The first days of the advance brought local penetrations of 10 to 20 kilometers, especially where combined arms groupings of infantry, T-34s, and self-propelled guns exploited gaps between German infantry divisions. The German response relied on counterattacks by Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions, aiming to seal breaches and gain time for rearward movement of heavy equipment and depots. Simultaneously, in the south, southwestern and southern fronts renewed their efforts in the Donbass. Beginning in mid-August and intensifying toward the end of the month, Malinovsky and Tolbukin directed their armies to cross rivers such as the Mius and the Seversky Donets and push toward industrial centers like Stalino, Makeyevka, and Gorlovka. For these fronts, the opening phase of the lower Dnieper offensive overlapped with the final stages of the Donbass battles. The objective was dual: to liberate the coal and industrial region and to drive German formations toward the Dnieper Bend and the lower river without allowing them to disengage in good order. Coordination among the 4 Soviet fronts in this early period relied on a combination of Stavka directives, direct liaison between staff officers, and boundary adjustments along the advancing lines. Front headquarters exchanged information on neighbouring army movements to ensure that gaps did not appear between sectors. For example, as Steppe Front advanced southwest of Kharkiv, its right flank had to remain aligned with Voronezh front units, pushing toward the Vorskla and Sel rivers, while its left flank coordinated with southwestern front units moving into northern Donbass. The need to synchronize artillery preparation times, air support schedules, and bridge building plans across several hundred kilometers created continual pressure on staff work and communications networks. On the German side, the opening phase was dominated by debates over how quickly to withdraw to the Dnieper line. Operationally, Manstein favored early, flexible retreats to avoid encirclement and preserve combat strength, but his proposals were constrained by orders from higher headquarters demanding that key areas, especially the Donbass and certain cities, be held as long as possible. This tension produced a pattern of phased withdrawals combined with counterattacks. German divisions often abandoned forward positions at night, withdrew to new lines prepared on ridges or river bends, and then used their remaining armoured units to strike Soviet spearheads that outran their infantry and artillery support. For local populations, the opening phase meant renewed movement of front lines, demolitions, and requisitions. As German units pulled back, they destroyed bridges, rail junctions, and industrial installations according to demolition plans, aiming to deny resources to the advancing Red Army. Soviet forces, in turn, attempted to capture bridges before demolition or to build pontoon structures quickly, where crossings were lost. Railway troops and engineer units worked to repair tracks and restore traffic behind the front. Civilian labour was mobilised on both sides, sometimes voluntarily, often under compulsion, to assist in demolitions or reconstruction. By early September, the combined effect of these operations had pushed German forces out of large parts of left bank Ukraine, east of Poltava, and from much of the eastern Donbass. But the main strategic objective remained ahead. The Dnieper, with its wide channel and high western banks in many sectors, still lay between the four Soviet fronts and their goal of expelling army groups south from Ukraine. The opening phase had achieved a series of rolling breakthroughs and withdrawals rather than a single decisive encirclement. It set the conditions for the next stage of the operation, in which planning for the Dnieper crossings and the race to secure bridgeheads on the right bank would come to the foreground. Strategic planning for the lower Dnieper offensive combined long-range political goals with immediate operational imperatives. For the Soviet leadership, the principal aims were clearly defined: destroy the main forces of Army Group southeast of the Dnieper, liberate left bank Ukraine including the Donbass industrial region, and secure a chain of bridgeheads on the right bank as starting points for further advances toward Kyiv, right bank Ukraine, and the borders of Romania and pre-war Poland. The offensive was not conceived as a single battle, but as a continuous sequence that would carry Soviet front lines from the Kharkiv and Myos sectors to and across the Dnieper within a few months. At the Stavka level, Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky coordinated the four participating fronts through a series of directives that set phased objectives and target dates. Voronezh and Stepa fronts were assigned the central role in reaching the middle Dnieper between Kremenchuk and Kyiv, with an emphasis on capturing crossings that could support a later advance on Kyiv itself. Southwestern and southern fronts received the task of forcing German withdrawal from the Donbass, securing the Dnieper bend between Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia, and pushing toward the lower Dnieper and the approaches to Crimea. The fronts were expected to maintain contact along their boundaries so that no gap would appear that German mobile forces could exploit. Soviet planning integrated ground, air, and riverine assets. The Red Army's engineer troops were instructed to assemble large stocks of bridging material, pontoons, assault boats, and improvised rafts at forward depots along likely crossing sectors. Where industrial production could not supply enough equipment, local resources were to be used, including fishing boats and barges. The Air Force assigned entire air armies to support the four fronts, with missions ranging from interdiction of German transport routes to direct support of Dnieper crossings and protection of bridgeheads from air attack. River flotillas on the Dnieper and its tributaries were tasked with ferrying troops and covering crossings with artillery and machine gun fire. Logistics planning reflected the scale of the operation and the length of the front, which in the forefront sector alone extended for several hundred kilometers. Railway troops had to restore destroyed tracks behind the advancing troops, convert captured lines to Soviet gauge where necessary, and push railheads forward fast enough to deliver ammunition, fuel, and replacements. Truck shortages required careful prioritization. High-octane fuel and artillery shells for tank and artillery units received precedence over other cargoes. Forward supply depots were established near key river approaches, assuming that once the Dnieper was reached, there would be little time to build up stocks before crossing attempts began. This planning depended on optimistic estimates of the speed of the advance and the capacity to repair infrastructure under continuous use. On the German side, planning centered on the so-called Panther-Wotan line, a system of defensive positions anchored largely on the Dnieper. Army Group South and the German General Staff intended to withdraw step by step from the Donetsk and Myos lines to the Dnieper, destroying bridges, rail junctions, and industrial installations behind them. The Dnieper's breadth and high western banks were expected to compensate for the numerical disadvantage. Infantry divisions reinforced with field fortifications, minefields, and anti-tank obstacles were to hold the river line, while panzer divisions would form an operational reserve to counterattack any Soviet bridgeheads that formed. However, the resources available to implement this concept were limited. Many infantry divisions were under strength, with some fielding 5,000 to 7,000 men, instead of their nominal establishment of more than 12,000. Shortages of trucks, bridging material, and construction machinery delayed both the withdrawal and the organization of new defensive positions. Luftflotte 4 was instructed to concentrate on attacking Soviet pontoon bridges and crossing sites once the Dnieper was reached, but the number of serviceable aircraft and fuel stocks had declined compared to previous years. German planners therefore had to rely heavily on demolitions and the delaying action of rear guards to buy time for fortification work on the western bank. Civilian and economic considerations entered both sides' planning. German occupation authorities prepared evacuation schedules for industrial equipment in the Donbass and other regions, attempting to move machinery west by rail while using forced labor for dismantling and loading. Where removal was not feasible, demolition teams received detailed instructions for rendering mines, power plants, and factories inoperative. Soviet planners, aware of the importance of these assets, urged front commanders to capture key installations before they could be destroyed. But the priority given to rapid operational progress often conflicted with this goal. Miscalculations shaped the emerging plans. On the Soviet side, expectations that German forces would not be able to form a continuous Dnieper line led to assumptions that multiple crossings could be secured quickly and expanded into large bridgeheads before German reserves arrived. The time required to assemble sufficient boats, pontoons, and artillery on the riverbanks was underestimated in some sectors. On the German side, confidence that the Dnieper and the Panther-Wotan positions would act as an effective barrier did not fully account for the possibility that Soviet armies would attempt simultaneous crossings along a very wide front, accepting high initial losses to secure even small footholds that could later be reinforced. Propaganda accompanied and simplified these planning debates for broader audiences. Soviet information organs presented the forthcoming operations as the decisive liberation of Ukraine, emphasizing the return of industrial centers and the crossing of the Great River as symbols of national recovery. German propaganda highlighted the construction of an eastern wall and claimed that the new defensive line would halt the Soviet advance, reassuring both domestic and frontline audiences. Behind these public narratives, staff officers on both sides prepared for an extended series of operations in which plans would be repeatedly adjusted to the realities of terrain, supply, and enemy reaction along the many hundreds of kilometers between the middle and lower Dnieper. The clash along the lower Dnieper sector began with a chain of fast-moving engagements in late August and September 1943, as Soviet armies pressed against German rearguards from the Donbass to the middle Dnieper. In the south, the Donbass strategic offensive reached its climax. From August 13th to September 22nd, southwestern and southern fronts forced German 6th Army and parts of 1st Panzer Army out of the Kol Basin, capturing key industrial centers. Horlivka and Artemivsk fell on September 5th, followed on September 8th by Stalino, the largest city of the region. Under pressure, Army Group South began to pull back more than 200 kilometers toward the Dnieper, trying to avoid encirclements while demolishing facilities and transport nodes behind it. German delaying actions in this phase combined organized defense with local counterattacks. Along the Mias and Seversky Donets lines, infantry divisions occupied previously prepared positions, while panzer groups assembled small Kampfgruppen to strike at Soviet units that advanced too quickly. One such counterstroke in early September hit the exposed flanks of Soviet mechanized corps caught between the 1st Panzer Army and the 6th Army, temporarily restoring contact between the withdrawing German formations and inflicting significant losses. However, limited armoured reserves and the need to keep retreat routes open prevented these local successes from changing the overall direction of events. The front continued to bend back toward the Dnieper. Further north, Voronezh and Steppe fronts fought the Chernigov-Poltava and Poltava-Kremenchuk operations. By mid-September, their leading armies were approaching the Great River along several converging axes. Advanced units of Central and Voronezh fronts reached the Dnieper in the area of the Pripyat confluence on 21st to 22nd September. Almost immediately, infantry detachments began improvised crossings, using boats, rafts, and sometimes swimming under fire to secure small footholds on the right bank. In this first phase, Soviet troops encountered only scattered German elements because many divisions were still moving toward the river and fortifications on the western bank remained incomplete. Within days, the pattern of the first Dnieper engagements took shape. On September 22nd, a bridgehead was established near the Dnieper-Pripyat junction. On 24th September, another was formed near Dnipro-Dzержinsk. On 25th September, additional crossings were made near Dnipropetrovsk, and on 28th September, a further foothold was secured near Kremenchuk. By the end of the month, Soviet forces held roughly 23 bridgeheads on the western bank, many of them only 10 kilometers wide and 1 to 2 kilometers deep, often consisting of thin lines of infantry clinging to steep ravines and river terraces. These improvised footholds would become the starting points for later, larger-scale operations. On the German side, the first Dnieper clashes revealed the gap between planning and reality. The Ostwall, or Eastern Wall concept, had envisaged a continuous defensive complex along the river, but fortifications were incomplete and unevenly distributed. Many units arrived on the west bank with reduced strength after weeks of retreat and combat. Rearguards tried to delay Soviet crossings by holding villages, road junctions, and river islands, then withdrawing to higher ground. Luftflotte, 4 concentrated available bomber and ground attack units against crossing points and pontoon parks, seeking to destroy ferries and bridges before heavy equipment could be brought across. Civilian life along the river and in the recently contested Donbass experienced another abrupt transformation. In areas evacuated by German forces, demolition teams blew up bridges, power stations, and industrial complexes according to scorched earth orders issued in early September, leaving behind ruined infrastructure and disrupted utilities. Villages on both banks became temporary strongpoints, with fields and gardens converted into artillery positions and mine belts. As Soviet units entered towns, local inhabitants often emerged from shelters to request food or protection, while new mobilization orders and security checks reshaped daily routines. The same river that had served as a transport artery before the war now became a dangerous zone where crossings, bombardments, and demolitions directly affected surrounding communities. Morale and perceptions diverged on each side. For Red Army soldiers and staffs, the rapid liberation of the Donbass and the establishment of multiple bridgeheads reinforced the belief that the strategic initiative had decisively shifted. Yet the high casualties suffered during river crossings, often under concentrated artillery and air attack, also made clear that progress would be costly. For German formations, the loss of the Donbass and the forced retreat to an unfinished river line were signs of deteriorating prospects, but the Dnieper itself and the still intact armoured reserves offered hope that the advance could be slowed or stabilised. These contrasting expectations set the psychological background for the next stage of the Lower Dnieper offensive, when scattered bridgeheads and fragmented rearguard actions would evolve into large-scale battles for control of the right bank. As September 1943 turned into October, the Lower Dnieper offensive moved from rapid advances to a phase of escalation and strain for all participants. The liberation of the Donbass, completed by late September with the capture of cities such as Stalino, Mariupol, and Melitopol, pulled the front even farther west. Soviet formations that had just fought through industrial districts and river lines now had to pivot toward the Dnieper Bend and the lower river, extending the active sector to roughly 700 kilometers from the area north of Kiev down to the Azov coast. The number of armies engaged rose, and the density of operations increased as both sides committed their reserves to stabilize or exploit the new situation. For the Red Army, reinforcement became a continuous process rather than a discrete event. Reserve rifle divisions, tank brigades, and artillery regiments were fed into existing armies to compensate for losses sustained during the approach marches and river crossings. Some rifle divisions operating near the bridgeheads had been reduced to 4,000 to 5,000 effective personnel, roughly half of their nominal strength, and required urgent replenishment to maintain offensive capacity. Tank Corps arrived at the river line with many of their original T-34s and light tanks lost in earlier battles, forcing them to concentrate remaining vehicles for localized thrusts instead of broad mechanized exploitation. Engineer units, which had been heavily used in the initial crossings, requested additional bridging equipment and personnel to repair damaged pontoon bridges under fire. The terrain and season magnified these difficulties. The high right bank of the Dnieper in many sectors offered good defensive positions to German troops, while the left bank floodplain, crossed by ravines and side channels, complicated Soviet deployment areas. Autumn rains turned dirt roads into mud, slowing vehicle movement and increasing fuel consumption. Artillery units struggled to bring heavy guns into positions close enough to support bridgeheads, and ammunition deliveries had to be organized via limited ferry capacity or temporary bridges that were frequent targets for air and artillery strikes. The need to maintain viable crossings for supply, while also preparing for offensive operations from the bridgeheads, produced overlapping demands on engineers and transport units. German forces experienced a parallel crisis, though from a different starting point. Many infantry and panzer divisions had been engaged almost continuously since the summer battles around Kursk and the Mius. By October, a number of divisions defending the Dnieper line in Ukraine operated at regimental or even reinforced battalion strength, with depleted artillery parks and shortages of motor transport. Nevertheless, Army Group South attempted to assemble counterattack groups composed of available Panzer and Panzer Grenadier units to strike Soviet bridgeheads before they could be fully developed. These attacks, often launched with 40 to 70 tanks and assault guns in individual sectors, inflicted losses and sometimes reduced or eliminated smaller footholds, but could not systematically clear the entire western bank. Command and control became more complex on the Soviet side as the number of bridgeheads and overlapping operations increased. Voronezh and Steppe fronts were responsible for multiple footholds along the central Dnieper, including the important Bukrin and later Lyutezh sectors, connected to plans for the liberation of Kiev. Southwestern and southern fronts faced similar challenges around Zaporizhia and the Nikopol region, where German forces clung to positions protecting access to manganese and other resources. Coordinating artillery preparation times, air missions, and the limited stock of assault boats across so many points of contact required frequent adjustments of front boundaries and staff responsibilities. Miscommunications occasionally led to gaps in coverage, with some attacking units receiving less artillery or air support than planned. Political considerations added further pressure. The Soviet leadership attached symbolic and political importance to the liberation of Kyiv, the capital of Soviet Ukraine, and to demonstrating to Allied governments that its forces could continue large-scale offensive operations in 1943. Target dates discussed at the highest level coincided with anniversaries and conferences, creating incentives for front commanders to accelerate operations even when logistical preparations were incomplete. This introduced tension between the military need to consolidate bridgeheads methodically and the political desire for rapid, visible successes on the right bank. On the German side, political and military priorities also diverged. Field commanders such as Manstein argued for flexible retreats from exposed salients and for concentrating reserves to destroy Soviet bridgeheads in individual operational counterblows. Higher headquarters, however, ordered that key regions such as the Nikopol bridgehead and the area south of Zaporizhzhia be held because of their economic value and perceived strategic importance. This led to situations in which German divisions remained in vulnerable positions along the river, exposed to artillery and air attack, in order to maintain control over specific localities rather than to optimize the overall defensive line. Civilian populations lived through this escalation as a combination of liberation, renewed fighting, and uncertainty. In areas east of the river that had changed hands, local administrations, collective farms, and factories were re-established under Soviet authority, while new mobilization waves drafted thousands of men into the Red Army or labor units. On the western bank, Villages inside or near German defensive zones were subjected to evacuation orders, requisitions, and fortification work. Civilians were employed to dig trenches, build bunkers, and repair roads. They were also affected by the expanding artillery duels across the river, which led to damage and casualties in settlements on both banks. Internationally, the intensifying battles along the Dnieper were followed as indicators of the wider course of the war. Allied governments examined reports on the liberation of major Ukrainian cities and the crossing of a major European river as evidence of the Soviet Union's growing offensive capacity. At the same time, German diplomatic representatives in Allied and occupied countries had to explain the loss of the Donbass and the retreat to the Dnieper as temporary setbacks within a longer defensive strategy. These external perceptions did not determine operational decisions, but they formed an additional layer of expectation as commanders and soldiers on both sides faced the practical crisis of extended fronts, rising casualties, and the need to decide whether to consolidate, counterattack, or attempt further crossings before winter. By October 1943, the lower Dnieper offensive reached its peak. The front had been extended, reorganized, and renamed. Voronezh Front became 1st Ukrainian Front, Steppe Front became 2nd Ukrainian Front, Southwestern Front became 3rd Ukrainian Front, and Southern Front became 4th Ukrainian Front. This change formalized what was already occurring in practice. 4 large operational groupings driving simultaneously towards the right bank of the Dnieper and deeper into Ukraine. In this phase, the focus shifted from reaching the river to breaking German resistance in major urban centers and expanding the fragile bridgeheads that had been secured in September. In the central sector, the question of how to liberate Kiev dominated planning. Initial attempts to use the Bukrin bridgehead south of the city in October, involving the 27th, 40th, and 47th Armies, with the 3rd Guards Tank Army in support, encountered strong German defences on difficult, ravine-cut terrain. Several attacks failed to achieve a breakthrough, with Soviet armoured units losing dozens of tanks in minefields and anti-tank belts, while infantry advanced only a few kilometres. These results led 1st Ukrainian Front to shift the main effort to the Lyutezh bridgehead north of Kyiv, requiring a covert redeployment of tank and rifle formations across the river at night, under strict camouflage and radio silence. Opposing them, 4th Panzer Army and elements of 8th Army tried to maintain a continuous line around Kiev and along the river. Panzer and Panzer Grenadier divisions were moved between sectors to counter Soviet thrusts at Bukrin and Lyutezh, but each movement consumed fuel and time, and the units arrived with reduced strength after previous engagements. German command decisions reflected a compromise between Hitler's orders to hold Kiev and Manstein's preference to shorten the line east of the city. The result was a dense but brittle defensive arc, with some infantry regiments defending extended fronts and relying heavily on field fortifications and artillery support. While preparations for the Kyiv operation were underway, the southern and central parts of the front experienced their own high-intensity battles. In mid-October, 2nd Ukrainian Front took part in the fighting for Dnipropetrovsk, where Soviet forces attacked from the left bank and from bridgeheads near Dniprodzerzhinsk. Street combat, fighting for industrial zones, and attempts to secure river crossings dominated the struggle. German troops conducted controlled demolitions of bridges and industrial equipment and pulled back toward the West Bank. But rear elements and local strongpoints continued to resist, causing additional casualties and damage. On 25 October, Soviet forces entered the city, although neighbouring sectors along the river remained contested. South of this area, 3rd and 4th Ukrainian fronts fought for Zaporizhzhia, the Dnieper Bend, and the approaches to the Nikopol bridgehead. The battles around Zaporizhzhia in early to mid-October involved repeated assaults on prepared positions that covered the city and the hydroelectric installations. German units withdrew from parts of the left bank under pressure, but tried to hold crossings and bridgeheads on the right bank that shielded access to manganese deposits around Nikopol. For the Soviet side, capturing these areas promised both a military and economic gains. For the German side, their retention was associated with continued access to valuable raw materials and a possible springboard for future operations. At the peak of the campaign, the four fronts drew on their maximum available firepower. Artillery concentrations supporting major assaults could reach several hundred guns and mortars per kilometre of front in key sectors, firing preparatory barrages and then shifting to rolling fire in support of advancing infantry. Air armies flew hundreds of sorties per day in combined roles, bombing German defensive lines, attacking transport columns on roads leading to and from the Dnieper, and attempting to suppress German air attacks on pontoon bridges. German air units, though numerically weaker, focused on striking crossing sites, ammunition dumps, and columns moving toward the bridgeheads, seeking to disrupt the Soviet tempo and slow the build-up for further attacks. Civilian suffering in this period reflected the concentration of combat in urban and industrial regions. In cities such as Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhzhia, artillery bombardments, demolitions, and street fighting destroyed housing, water systems, and power networks. German demolition teams left behind mines and booby traps in buildings and infrastructure, causing casualties among returning inhabitants and Soviet troops engaged in clearance work. Evacuation measures initiated earlier by German authorities had moved some workers and their families to the west, but large numbers of civilians remained in place, experiencing shortages of food, medical supplies, and shelter as front lines passed through their districts. For soldiers on both sides, the peak of the lower Dnieper offensive meant prolonged operations with limited operational pauses. Soviet rifle divisions often remained in contact for weeks, alternating between attacking, holding, and consolidating positions within or near the bridgeheads. German units were repeatedly shifted between threatened sectors, sometimes covering long distances by rail or road, only to be committed immediately to counterattacks. Fatigue, weather, and the psychological impact of fighting around major cities and river lines affected morale. Commanders at front, army, and corps level had to balance the exhaustion of their formations against the perceived necessity of maintaining pressure or holding positions that higher authorities considered politically or economically significant. By early November, the concentration of forces, the complexity of simultaneous operations along the river, and the competing demands of political and military priorities produced a situation in which both sides were operating at or near the limits of their resources in Ukraine. It was within this context of extended fronts, heavily contested bridgeheads, and intensified urban and riverine combat that the next events unfolded. The offensive from the Lyutezh bridgehead toward Kyiv, and the gradual consolidation of Soviet positions on the right bank that would shape the subsequent turning point of the campaign. Resistance and adaptation defined the next stage of the lower Dnieper offensive on both sides of the front. After the failures at Bucharin and setbacks in assaults on other bridgeheads, First Ukrainian Front re-examined its methods. Staffs adjusted the balance between armour and infantry in river operations, assigning tank armies to exploit breakthroughs from already established footholds, rather than to force crossings directly. Engineer units increased the use of night construction and camouflage for pontoon bridges, reducing losses from air attack. Assault battalions were reorganised with higher proportions of submachine gunners, sappers, and flamethrower teams for close combat in ravines, and built up areas on the right bank. The decision to shift the main effort for Kyiv from the Bucharin bridgehead to Lyutezh was itself a form of operational adaptation. Between mid-October and early November, several rifle divisions, the 3rd Guards Tank Army, and supporting artillery were quietly transferred from the southern sector to the northern bridgehead. Movement was conducted largely at night, with strict radio discipline and deception measures to suggest continued build-up at Bucharin. This redeployment reflected lessons learned about terrain. The steep, dissected right bank near Buchrin favoured defenders, while the Liutej area, though also fortified, allowed a more direct approach to Kiev once a breakout was achieved. German forces responded with their own forms of resistance. Around the main bridgeheads, infantry units constructed layered defensive positions that combined trenches, dug-in machine guns, anti-tank guns, and minefields. Local counterattacks were organised using available tanks and assault guns, often in groups of 20 to 40 vehicles, to strike Soviet units at the moment of deployment from bridgeheads onto the open plateau. German commanders adapted by shifting the axis of their counterblows, depending on Soviet movements, sometimes striking from the flanks rather than directly from the front, and by using the broken terrain to mask approach routes for armoured groups. Air and artillery tactics also evolved. Soviet air armies increased the number of fighter sweeps over crossing areas before and during major movements, seeking to reduce the effectiveness of German bombing of ferries and bridges. Bomber units shifted focus from strategic targets deeper in the rear to interdiction of roads leading to the Dnieper, aiming to slow the arrival of German reserves. Artillery staffs developed detailed firing plans for the protection of bridgeheads, including scheduled barrages on likely assembly areas for counterattacking units and rapid response procedures for shifting fire onto columns detected by forward observers. German artillery in turn refined its registration of crossing sites and pontoon approaches, firing pre-planned concentrations on these zones when movement was detected, and used forward observers on the high right bank to adjust fire in real time. In the southern sectors, around Zaporizhia and the Nikopol bridgehead, both sides experimented with different combinations of offensive and defensive measures. Third and Fourth Ukrainian fronts tested limited attacks aimed not at immediate breakthrough, but at forcing the Germans to expend ammunition and reveal artillery positions, which were then targeted by counter-battery fire. German units adapted by shortening their lines where possible, and by constructing strongpoints in depth behind the riverbank, so that even if Soviet units forced a crossing at one point, they would face successive defensive belts rather than a single line. Partisan formations and underground networks in Ukraine played a supporting role in this phase. Groups operating in wooded and marshy areas north and west of Kiev attacked German transport columns, damaged railway tracks, and reported the movement of reserves and construction of new defensive positions. Their actions, sometimes coordinated with front headquarters, complicated German efforts to move units between threatened sectors. At the same time, German security forces adapted by increasing patrols, improving convoy protection, and carrying out punitive operations in areas suspected of aiding partisans, which in turn affected civilian populations with arrests, deportations, and destruction of property. On the Soviet side, resource management became a central issue. Fronts had to decide how to allocate limited stocks of bridging equipment, fuel, and artillery ammunition among multiple bridgeheads and urban operations. Commanders restructured their divisions, disbanding units that had been reduced below combat effectiveness and using their personnel to replenish others. Specialized river crossing units were rotated between sectors as needed, carrying with them experience and improvised techniques from previous operations. Medical and evacuation services adapted to the conditions of river warfare, establishing aid posts close to crossing points and organizing boat and barge traffic not only for supplies and reinforcements but also for the wounded. For German forces, adaptation often meant economizing strength while maintaining resistance. Understrength infantry battalions were consolidated, non-essential rear area services were reduced, and available trucks were reallocated to ensure mobility for artillery and armoured units. Commanders increasingly relied on flexible defence, yielding ground in less critical sectors to maintain stronger groupings around key cities, road junctions, and bridgeheads such as Nikopol. Orders emphasised delaying actions, elastic withdrawals from forward positions, and the use of counterattacks only where they promised tangible operational benefit rather than symbolic value. Morale responses to these adaptations varied. Many Red Army soldiers interpreted the reorganization of units and the visible preparations for new offensives from the bridgeheads as signs that their efforts were leading toward the complete liberation of Ukraine, but they also experienced repeated attacks across the same river lines as a source of fatigue and apprehension. German soldiers, aware of the cumulative retreats since summer, often saw their defensive innovations and successful local counterattacks as proof that resistance remained possible. Yet the continued pressure along a wide front and the loss of major cities reduced confidence in the longer term. Civilian populations adjusted to the new conditions in different ways depending on which side of the river they lived on and which authority controlled their area. On the liberated left bank, residents participated in reconstruction, clearing mines and repairing roads, while adapting to renewed state controls, rationing systems, and mobilization. On the still occupied right bank, communities near the front lived with curfews, requisitions, and periodic evacuations. In both zones, local knowledge of terrain and infrastructure was drawn into military planning. Guides, boatmen, and engineers from the region contributed to crossing operations or defensive preparations, illustrating how adaptation to the extended campaign drew in not only military structures, but also broader segments of the population. The turning point of the Lower Dnieper offensive came in early November 1943, with the successful use of the WWII bridgehead north of Kiev. After the costly, inconclusive attempts to break out from Bucharin, First Ukrainian Front concentrated 3 armies and 3rd Guards Tank Army in the WWII sector. In total, several 100,000 Soviet troops, several hundred tanks and self-propelled guns, and dense artillery groupings were assembled on the right bank under cover of night movements and strict radio discipline. Opposite them, elements of 4th Panzer Army and 8th Army held a curved defensive line around Kiev, with understrength infantry divisions and mobile reserves drawn from Panzer and Panzer Grenadier formations. On November 3rd, after an artillery preparation that focused on identified strong points and suspected artillery positions, First Ukrainian Front launched its offensive from the WWII bridgehead. Rifle divisions pushed south and southwest to break the immediate German defensive belt, while 3rd Guards Tank Army and mechanized formations were committed through the gaps to exploit toward Kiev's northern and western approaches. The attacking units advanced through forested and ravine-cut terrain, encountering prepared positions and minefields, but also sectors where German defences had been thinned to meet previous threats at Bucharin. By November 4th, Soviet spearheads had penetrated several kilometres, threatening to outflank German units defending the city from the east and southeast. German commanders reacted by shifting available reserves toward the threatened axes. Panzer groups mounted counterattacks against advancing Soviet tank and rifle units, aiming to restore the line and prevent a breakthrough into the open terrain west of Kiev. These actions, conducted with limited numbers of tanks and assault guns, temporarily slowed the advance and inflicted losses, but could not fully seal the breaches that had opened. At the same time, the possibility of encirclement emerged. If First Ukrainian Front's forces continued to advance southwest and south from WWII, they could cut the main supply routes leading into Kiev from the west and south, leaving the city garrison in a vulnerable salient. Faced with this situation, German command decided to withdraw from Kiev to avoid the destruction or capture of major formations. During the night of 5th to 6th November, under covering fire and in difficult weather conditions, German units pulled out of many positions inside and around the city, leaving rear guards to delay the Soviet entry and destroy remaining logistical stocks and installations. On November 6th, Soviet troops entered Kiev from the north and northwest, while other units closed in from the east. Street fighting continued in some districts, but the main German forces had already begun to move toward new positions further west. The loss of Kiev meant that the right bank capital of Soviet Ukraine passed out of German control and that a large, operationally significant bridgehead was now firmly established on the western bank of the Dnieper. The repercussions of this breakthrough extended beyond the city itself. the WWII bridgehead expanded into a wider staging area for subsequent operations toward Żytomir, Berdyszów, and the approaches to the pre-war Polish border. German attempts to counter this development included a series of counteroffensives west of Kiev in November and early December, in which panzer divisions struck at extended Soviet lines and recaptured some towns, including Żytomir for a time. These operations demonstrated that German forces retained the capacity for local offensive action, but they did not restore the Dnieper as a stable front. Even when German attacks forced Soviet units back in certain sectors, the main bridgeheads remained in Soviet hands, and the general line of contact stayed on the right bank. For the broader lower Dnieper sector, the fall of Kiev coincided with continued advances further south. 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts consolidated or enlarged their own bridgeheads, pressed on Zaporizhia and the Dnieper Bend, and pushed toward Kryvyi Rih and Nikopol. The accumulative effect was that by late November, the Wehrmacht had been driven from almost all of left bank Ukraine, and the Dnieper had ceased to be a secure defensive barrier. Army Group South faced the prospect of defending an increasingly fragmented line in right bank Ukraine, with its forces divided between holding remaining bridgeheads such as Nikopol and responding to Soviet thrusts west and southwest. Civilian experiences reflected this turning point in different ways. In Kiev, inhabitants emerging from shelters found a city damaged by bombardments and demolitions, with bridges destroyed, public buildings ruined, and basic services disrupted. Soviet authorities quickly began re-establishing administrative structures, security organs, and supply systems, while also conducting investigations into collaboration and organizing repairs. In rural zones west of the Dnieper, the German withdrawal and subsequent counter-offensives brought repeated changes of control, requisitions, and evacuations, exposing residents to shifting demands from both armies. The retention of substantial Soviet bridgeheads on the right bank meant that the front would not return to the river line. Instead, villages and towns deeper in right bank Ukraine would now become part of an evolving front zone. Militarily, the success at WWII and the capture of Kiev marked the point at which the lower Dnieper offensive achieved its central strategic aim, establishing enduring Soviet positions on the western bank of the river across a wide sector. From this stage onward, the operational question for the Red Army was less whether it could cross the Dnieper, and more how far and how quickly it could advance into right bank Ukraine before logistical limits, German counterattacks, or winter conditions imposed a pause. For the Wehrmacht, the turning point meant that the concept of a continuous eastern wall along the Dnieper had effectively failed in Ukraine, forcing a transition from river line defense to a series of more flexible but increasingly improvised positions deeper inside the region. By late November and December 1943, the lower Dnieper offensive transitioned from continuous advance to a phase of consolidation and localized fighting. Along much of the river, the main combat actions shifted away from direct crossings to battles deeper in right bank Ukraine and to the stabilization of new lines. First Ukrainian Front extended its bridgehead beyond Kiev toward Żytomir and Berdyszów, while 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Ukrainian fronts pushed west and southwest from their positions along the Dnieper Bend and lower river. The former eastern bank, which had been a contested front line only weeks earlier, now lay behind Soviet lines and began to be integrated once more into the Soviet administrative space. For the Wehrmacht, this phase was characterized by withdrawal and attempts to create new defensive positions. After leaving Kiev, German forces conducted counteroffensives west of the city, recapturing Żytomir in mid-November and temporarily stabilizing the situation along a line that ran through Korostyn, Żytomir, and southward. These operations involved several Panzer and Panzergrenadier divisions and inflicted significant casualties on Soviet units that had advanced rapidly after the capture of Kiev. However, subsequent Soviet attacks in December pushed German formations back again, and by the end of the year, the front in northern Ukraine lay clearly on the right bank, with German units holding positions further west and southwest of their former Dnieper line. In the southern sectors, immediate withdrawal from all right bank bridgeheads did not occur. The Nikopol-Kryvyi bridgehead remained in German hands, serving as a base for the defense of manganese and industrial areas and as a potential platform for counterattacks. Third and Fourth Ukrainian fronts contained this salient while preparing for later operations to eliminate it. Elsewhere along the lower Dnieper, German units pulled back from many positions directly on the river to lines slightly farther inland, where terrain and existing infrastructure allowed more favourable defensive dispositions. These movements reduced the importance of the river itself as a continuous barrier and transformed the conflict into a series of operations across right bank Ukraine. The end of the main phase of the lower Dnieper offensive on the 23rd of December 1943 did not mean an abrupt cessation of fighting, but marked the formal conclusion of the coordinated effort by four fronts to clear left bank Ukraine and secure bridgeheads. In total, during this period, the Red Army had advanced hundreds of kilometers, liberated major cities including Kiev, Dnipropetrovsk, and Zaporizhzhia, and established multiple footholds on the right bank. Estimates for Soviet casualties in the broader Battle of the Dnieper, including killed, wounded, and missing, range from approximately 1,200,000 to 1,500,000 personnel, while German and Allied losses in the same theatre are often estimated in the range of 400,000 to 500,000. These figures indicate the scale of attrition experienced by both sides in reaching and crossing the river. For civilians, the immediate aftermath involved both relief and new hardships. In areas retaken by Soviet forces, occupation policies imposed earlier by German authorities ceased, forced labor detachments were dissolved, and persecution of specific groups ended. At the same time, returning Soviet administrations conducted screenings to identify collaboration, reintroduced pre-war institutions, and organized new mobilization and labor obligations. Housing shortages, food deficits, and damaged infrastructure constrained living conditions. Many towns had lost a large percentage of their buildings and industrial capacity, and agricultural areas bore the traces of trench systems, minefields, and shelling. On the German-controlled side of the new front, withdrawal and occupation continued in compressed form. Villages and towns in right bank Ukraine that lay behind the new line experienced an influx of retreating units and administrative personnel. Evacuation of industrial equipment, livestock, and food stocks proceeded as far as rail and road capacity permitted. Where time and transportation were insufficient, demolition teams destroyed bridges, depots, and facilities according to existing orders. Civilian populations in these regions faced tightened security measures, further requisitions, and uncertainty about the duration of German control, given the proximity of the front. Prisoners of war and displaced persons formed another aspect of the immediate consequences. The lower Dnieper battles produced tens of thousands of captives on both sides. Soviet reports recorded large numbers of German and Allied prisoners captured during river crossings, encirclements in Donbass localities, and withdrawals from urban centres. German forces also took Soviet prisoners during counterattacks west of Kiev and in engagements near the bridgeheads, although the balance of captures increasingly favoured the Soviet side as the campaign progressed. Civilians who had been deported for labour or had moved with withdrawing German units found themselves in transit camps or temporary settlements, awaiting transport or repatriation as the front continued to move. In the wider Allied context, the outcome of the lower Dnieper offensive influenced strategic assessments at the end of 1943. The liberation of most of Ukraine east of the Dnieper and the establishment of firm positions on the right bank were noted in diplomatic reports as evidence that German forces could no longer rely on major natural obstacles in the east to maintain a stable front. Within the region itself, however, the aftermath remained defined by the local realities of destroyed infrastructure. altered administrative structures, and the presence of large military formations preparing either to continue their advance or to defend new lines. The formal end of the offensive thus marked a transition rather than a clear break, as both armies and civilian populations adjusted to the new configuration of control across Ukraine. In retrospect, the Lower Dnieper offensive occupies a central place in the military history of the Eastern Front. In purely operational terms, it marked the transition from a front line anchored on major natural obstacles in eastern Ukraine to a new configuration in which Soviet forces held permanent positions on the right bank. The expulsion of the Wehrmacht from almost all of left bank Ukraine and the establishment of multiple bridgeheads on the western shore created the basis for the 1944 campaigns in right bank Ukraine, Moldova, and further into Central Europe. For the Red Army, the 4 Ukrainian fronts that emerged from this operation became the primary instruments for later offensives toward Korsun-Shevchenkovsky, Nikopol-Kryvyi Rih, Uman-Botoshani, and Lvov-Sandomierz. From the German perspective, the outcome forced a reassessment of operational planning and strategic expectations. The concept of stabilizing a long-term defensive line along the Dnieper and associated fortified positions proved unachievable in Ukraine under the existing conditions of manpower, equipment, and air support. Army Group South, later reorganized into Army Group South and A, had to continue retreating from one temporary line to another, while simultaneously trying to hold economically important areas such as the Nikopol region. The loss of the Donbass and most of Ukraine's industrial base affected the German war economy and reduced the ability to replace material lost in continuous defensive battles. Politically, the offensive reinforced the Soviet Union's claim to be carrying the main ground burden of the war in Europe. The liberation of Kiev and major industrial centers in Ukraine in late 1943 occurred in parallel with Allied operations in Italy and preparations for the cross-channel invasion, demonstrating to foreign observers that the Red Army could sustain high-intensity operations on a broad front. Within the Soviet system, the campaign was presented as a step toward restoring pre-war borders and re-establishing control over key regions. For local populations in Ukraine, it meant the end of German occupation east of the Dnieper, but also the return of Soviet authority, with its own set of political, social, and economic consequences. Economically and socially, the long-term effects were substantial. The destruction of infrastructure during the retreat and offensive, combined with prior occupation policies, left much of the region's industrial and agricultural capacity damaged or temporarily inoperative. Post-war reconstruction programs in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic focused heavily on the Dnieper cities and the Donbass, rebuilding power stations, mines, and factories that had been fought over during the offensive. The need to repair railways, bridges, and urban housing stock shaped regional development for years, while war losses in population and resources influenced demographic and economic structures well into the post-war period. On the level of military thought, the offensive contributed to later doctrines regarding river crossings, operational depth, and multi-front coordination. The Red Army's experience in organizing simultaneous operations by 4 fronts along a sector of roughly 700 kilometers, while conducting multiple crossings of a major river, provided practical examples of both possibilities and limitations. Lessons were drawn about the concentration of engineer resources, the timing of artillery and air support across wide fronts, and the importance of flexible front boundaries. German staff analyses after the war highlighted the difficulties of holding extended river lines against an opponent able to mount numerous crossing attempts and to accept high initial losses in order to establish bridgeheads. Collective memory of the Lower Dnieper offensive has differed among societies and periods. In Soviet historiography and public commemoration, the campaign was presented primarily as a liberation of Ukrainian territory and a demonstration of the Red Army's growing operational skill. Commemorative dates, monuments, and museum exhibits in Kyiv, Dnipro, Zaporizhzhia, and other cities emphasized the Dnieper crossings and the recovery of the capital. In Ukraine after 1991, discussions expanded to include the experiences of civilians under both occupation and post-liberation policies, the role of local populations in partisan warfare and reconstruction, and the diverse national composition of the units that fought in the region. In Germany, the same events entered historical narratives as part of a series of defensive battles and retreats in 1943 to 1944. Memoirs and studies by former officers often focused on the attempts to implement riverline defenses, the use of armoured reserves in counterattacks, and the impact of declining resources. These accounts sometimes emphasized local tactical successes or withdrawals executed without encirclement, while acknowledging that the overall strategic situation continued to deteriorate after the loss of the Dnieper line. Western historiography, drawing on multiple sources, has tended to view the Lower Dnieper offensive as one of the largest and most costly operations of the war, stressing its scale and its role in shifting the front line far to the west. Debates among historians have included questions about the planning and conduct of the offensive. Some analyses concentrate on the high Soviet casualty figures and ask whether different operational choices, such as concentrating on fewer crossings or delaying certain assaults until more bridging equipment was available, might have reduced losses. Others examine German decisions to retain bridgeheads like Nikopol and to defend certain cities for extended periods, assessing whether these choices yielded sufficient strategic benefit in relation to the forces committed. Underlying these discussions is a broader question about how both sides balance military, economic, and political objectives within a campaign that combined liberation, withdrawal, and attrition on a very large scale. For participants and later generations, the Lower Dnieper offensive thus has multiple legacies. For soldiers in the 4 Soviet fronts, it marked a transition from prolonged defensive and back-and-forth fighting in earlier years to a sustained westward advance that would continue until the end of the war. For German troops, it represented another step in a sequence of retreats, accompanied by efforts to adapt tactics and preserve units under increasingly unfavourable conditions. For civilians in Ukraine, it brought both the end of one occupation and the beginning of reconstruction under another state system, with long-term social and cultural implications. In the broader history of the Second World War, the campaign stands as an example of a large-scale, multi-front offensive that combined river crossings, urban battles, and wide-ranging manoeuvre across open terrain. Its outcome reshaped the strategic situation in Eastern Europe, removed the Dnieper as a potential long-term barrier to Soviet advances, and set the stage for the 1944 operations that would carry the war into the territories of Axis allies and eventually into the heartlands of Germany itself.